Stefano Albertini, I'm the director of the Casa. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight, especially those of you who are here for the first time. To me, this is already a successful event, and the two signs that it's successful is there are a few students with their laptop open, and the second thing, Gianni Riotti is in the audience. Gianni Riotti is right there. He's the former director of the TG1, that is the most important Italian TV news show, and an old friend of mine and of the Casa and of Minister Siniscalco, I just learned. So thank you to all of you. New friends and to old friends as well. This event is organized by the School of Liberal Studies here at New York University, and we are delighted to pair with them. I was just telling Dean Mostov that I've seen more of her, even if she has been to NYU for less than a year, than all the deans of CAS, that is the school from which we depend, in my career. So I think on some level we might want to secede and go under the umbrella of liberal studies. And as you know, there are also more reasons for the Casa Italiana to be very close to liberal studies. The faculties like Professor Manaz Yousef-Zada and Jenny McPhee, with whom we have a variety of different initiatives every year. And also the fact that many students of liberal studies spend their first year in Florence or their second year in Florence at La Pietra, and they come back to New York with a love for Italian language and Italian culture that we hope we are able to nurture and support with what we do. We are delighted to have this opportunity to welcome you and to talk about the issues that are going to be discussed tonight. And I just want to introduce very briefly Dean Julie Mostov, who just arrived, actually returned to NYU because she's a graduate of NYU. And she came back as Dean of the School of Liberal Studies here last August, so almost completing her first full academic year at NYU on the Square. And she comes from Drexel University, where she was Senior Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and a Professor of Politics. And her scholarship concentrates on the politics of national identity, sovereignty, and citizenship, and genders, and explores the notions of soft borders and transnational citizenship. So she's the perfect person to enter in a dialogue with Mr. Siniscalco this evening. So without further ado, I don't want to take away any more of their time, and I'm asking you to please welcome Dean Julie Mostov.
Thank you so much, Stefano. I appreciate that. And it is wonderful to be here in the Casa Italiana. So I want to thank you for your hospitality, and also our other co-sponsors, the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies and the Department of Economics. I want to thank Dee, as most of us know her, Denisha Simmons-Jendaya, for all the work she's done in putting this program together. So tonight, we are truly fortunate to have Professor Domenico Siniscalco, who is the Managing Director and Vice Chair of Morgan Stanley International, with responsibilities for developing relationships with key clients across Europe, particularly for Italy, and in charge of Italy, and the governments of emerging markets, which probably in many ways is the most interesting part of his job. He has a career spanning over 25 years at the highest levels in business, government, and the academy. So his degree is in law, originally from the University of Torino, where he hails from, and has a Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge. He's taught at Cambridge, Torino, the Catholic University of Louvain, and now at NYU. Professor Siniscalco was the Director General of the Italian Treasury and Minister of Economy and Finance for Italy. As such, he has been a member of the Eurogroup of the European Council of Economy and Finance Ministers, a member of the G7, G8, a governor of the IMF, and much more. He has served on boards of several Italian-listed companies, including Telecom Italia and ENI, and a leading member of nonprofit institutions, including the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, known better as, and also a member of the Swedish Royal Academy of Science. Those are just a few of his associations. He is the author of a number of academic books and articles in such publications as European Economic Review and the Journal of Public Economics. And most importantly, he and his wife Christina have 2 sons at NYU and liberal studies, Marco and Enrico. Please join me in welcoming to tonight's event our newest member of the NYU community, Professor Siniscalco.
Well, thank you very much, Julie and Stefano. You obviously have been too kind because reality is more gray than black and white. But the real claim to fame here is to be member of the NYU family, parent of students here, and I hope this will be the first opportunity to continue this cooperation. Talking about Europe today is really very timely. Because, in my opinion, once again, Europe is at a juncture. Is at a juncture because probably the trust among member states is at the ebb, because Europe has been subject to many pressures, from migration to the economic and financial crisis, etc., etc. And, I mean, consistently with Julie's field of study, is back again to nationalism and national selfishness. So we are really talking at a very important moment. Today, by chance, I met Tony Blair. We discussed a few minutes about Europe. There are countries like Great Britain who are probably worse off than us, meaning Italy, but certainly is not a great moment. Nevertheless, as I will try to argue, the fundamentals are in favor of Europe once again. A turning once again is not my view. I will produce Eurobarometer statistics about the mood of the citizens, etc. So in my opinion, all the ingredients to relaunch the European project are there, if and only if the leaders will be able to convey the idea that Europe is next to the citizens, is not a technocracy away from them, and can do things that are tangible, useful, and nice to the people. So my speech will be fundamentally short, to leave ample space, given the quality of the audience, to Q&A, but it will be divided in 3 parts. The first part quickly recalls Europe as the project that accompanied my entire life. I was born in 1954, so between the treaties of Paris and the treaties of Rome. And since the beginning, Europe was a notion, I would say a value, that accompanied my generation in my country. Then I will, and these are fundamentally the first 3 points. Then I will discuss briefly the weaknesses of the European construction, which is fundamentally the lack of political governance. And then I'll say why the response has been, I'll talk about the fact that the response has been populist to all these challenges, but I'll finish shedding some rosy picture on this otherwise pretty concerned picture, in saying that the fundamentals are there and trying to discuss with you. I have no answers, but what could be the recipe for another fresh start of the European project. Why am I interested in that, and why do I believe it's crucial? Well, because fundamentally the European project has been the response to the war, the response to fragmentation, to all these terrible crimes that happened in those days, where Europe was designed as an antidote, if you want, as a response to that. But let's go a little bit in order and discuss. These are the main steps in Europe. We start by the European Commission on Coal and steel, CECA, which means Commission Européenne sur le Charbon et l'Acier, which was the embryo of Europe, because these 6 countries were the founding members of Europe, France, Germany, Italy, plus Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, decided to build an embryo of a union around the economy, steel and coal at the time. Then there was the Rome Treaty. The Rome Treaty is fantastic because it lays the ground of what Europe will be in the next few years at the time. So an area of free circulation of goods, services, people, and capital. These are the main pillars of Europe, and no one can cherry pick on them as a certain island is trying to do recently. Then there were other important steps, the Single Act, the Treaty of European Union, the Maastricht Treaty, then the single market, and finally Schengen. Schengen is not a treaty, is a multilateral agreement, intergovernmental agreement on free circulation of people without papers, fundamentally, in this area. And finally the euro. We should discuss whether the Europe is part of the solution or part of the problem. The picture is not black and white. I'm in favor. I believe that for countries like Italy, it provided a fundamental anchor to Europe to do reforms, etc. I believe it was a way to protect our savings, which until then were repeatedly attacked by devaluations, etc. But I also believe, and this cannot be denied, that after the introduction of the euro, the growth rate of Italy vis-à-vis the other European countries halved. And this is not related to bad weather. I mean, it has something to do with that. So this is an open question, and we should discuss in a non-dogmatic way about what to do. So this is the timeline of what happened. You see in parallel how the geographical footprint expanded. So the dark blue is the 6 founding members. Then you have Denmark, Ireland, United Kingdom in 1973 with a referendum where Great Britain decided to join. Then you have Greece, standalone, Portugal and Spain are the green ones, as you see. Then all the other one until the very famous enlargement by Romano Prodi in 2004. I was in government at the time. Romano is a friend and a colleague in academia. He was teaching the same topic I was, industrial economics. I told him that in my opinion was too fast and too wide, because this country, I mean, until then, the European Union was built on the notion of convergence. Convergence meaning being similar. Those countries were not similar. I remember when Poland joined with the others, I was a good friend of the Polish minister, they recognized they were not ready. But the reason why Romano Prodi pushed for the accession of 10 countries at once was fundamentally to give an answer to their request after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He said, we cannot push them out because there is a parameter out of line, so let's get them in. But at the same time, he created a more heterogeneous Europe. Even now, you know, this Visegrad group is not exactly aligned with the others. More importantly, I remember, Cristina was there, we invited all the ministers of the new accession countries in Gaeta to go to Ventotene, where we went. Gosh, I had the impression that there was a long way to go to integrate them, because while we were talking about values, big topics, etc., the discussion quickly went to the budget, to the subsidies, how much do you give me for my hens? Hence gallina, is l'avicolo, it's the Polish obsession, etc. So it was, I mean, it was quite disquieting, and that was the month after the accession. Anyway, so the footprint has been expanding, and of course, then there is the Brexit, which is the first case in which one country of the European Union decides to leave. That's very interesting, because until then, the art of Great Britain was to be in and out at the same time. So one step in, we are members. One step out, I want my money back. That was the motto by Margaret Thatcher at the time. What they did, in my opinion, was a bit crazy, if I may, and it was to put a topic like that to a referendum. Referendums, I don't know, are for ethical question, divorce, abortion, death penalty, whatever, where people have strong a priori. But how can you put to a referendum with a simple majority and no quorum a decision which is so complex and no one, even today, grasps completely the consequences? Anyway, they voted and they are out. So it's N-1 at the moment. I mentioned the fact that some politicians or leaders talked about big ideals where other people were talking about big subsidies. But we always had three notions of Europe coexisting. A group of people, which are the Gasperi, Adenauer, the old guys, Spinelli, the fathers of Europe, that always thought about Europe as a political process to create a political union against the horrors of the war, of the Second World War, as an antidote to the war, etc., etc. Of course, it was built since 1951 on the economy as a glue. But that was instrumental. It was kind of a Troy horse. Let's use the economy to create the political union. Padoa-Schioppa was one of the latest, Romano Prodi, you name it. Then there was a group of people, mainly Britain, who always seen Europe as a market. So we want an open market, and even the creation of the euro as a single currency, which is not a British project, was in relation to that. You cannot have a single market unless you have a single currency, because otherwise you have competitive devaluations. But it was the idea of Europe as a huge market. When you hear people that say, but we are 300 million people with XYZ consumption, bigger than the US, etc., we are fundamentally, you listen to people that think of Europe as a market and not as a union. Finally, there is the German view, which sees Europe as a monetary union, fiscal union perhaps in the future, a banking union, and they see Europe as a set of rules. If you read, I don't suggest it, but if you ever read the Maastricht Treaty, it's exactly that. It's a book of rules, and you have to play by those rules, otherwise you're out. So it's yet another thing. It's not a free market, they don't care. It's not the political ideal, but it's fundamentally this kind of union. What is the problem? The problem is that due to the fact that countries are jealous owners, etc., this design was always incomplete. So we had a couple of very important areas where the communitarian model is approved. One is money with ECB, and one is antitrust, where Europe decides as a single one is trade as well, where Europe decides as a single body, but in all the other areas it's intergovernmental. So it's incomplete, because of course politicians know that the national state in Europe is still the place of democracy. So you win and lose the election nationally, you don't win and lose the election in Brussels, where fundamentally no one cares. I'm exaggerating, someone cares, but not many. So it's an incomplete design. It's also a group of countries where demography is terrible, because contrary to China, contrary to India, we have a very old population, maybe very wealthy, but fundamentally old. And the two things together, being old and being wealthy, is not an ideal cocktail for innovation. So when the crisis arrived, and finally there was this enlargement, which was too fast, as I mentioned. So when the crisis arrived, the economic and financial crisis, it hit countries that were not yet completely integrated. They were still diverging. They are in this incomplete design where the national jealousy was still playing an important role, and then migration arrived. migration is probably beneficial on paper, is probably beneficial on the economy, but if you live in an area with strong migration, the social norms are put under stress. And this is what created this anti-immigrant attitude, which was so important in the last few elections, not only in Italy, but in England. Probably many sociologists in England in Britain would tell you that migration was one of the triggers of the Brexit vote. In France, Germany was only diverging from that because thanks to Merkel in the previous government, they opened up. But anyway, as a result, Europe, instead of being a dream or instead of being the promised land, gradually stopped delivering. Growth is too low, youth unemployment, which is even worse, is too high, inequality is too high, and nobody's happy. So the consensus on Europe, which was very high, 70% until a certain moment, dropped dramatically, was cut in half from 70 to 30% of the population. And in a series of elections, general election, populists won. There is fundamentally, this is the new response to a crisis. In the previous century, the response to a crisis like that was the emergence of the left parties, traditional left parties. But the left parties here were proved not to be able to protect the weakest. Then if you put that together with the pressures, with the social media, etc., it created a completely different way of doing politics, which is no more the representation of the organized interest, like in Susanne Berger's book, if you remember it, but rather is the representation of the deprived people at the individual level. So this was populism. Then one might argue, as I do, whether populism is actually a deeply rooted ideology or rather a way to conquer the power. Certainly in some countries, take Hungary recently, is a deep-rooted ideology, maybe even Alternative for Deutschland is. But in other countries, it's probably a way to conquer the power, leveraging this discontent by the general public. Here there is a beautiful paper by our friend Moises Naim, who analyzes the common feature of populism. And he finds out a number of attributes of populists that are very similar across the board, not only in Europe, also in this country, for example, or in Britain or in Europe. So populists claim to be different from the establishment. They tend to magnify the problems of a country, the fear of migration, migrants are all criminals, the social elevator doesn't work anymore, education is a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. So they magnify the problem. They criminalize opposition. They describe society as fundamentally two groups. The pure hardliners, who are them, against the corrupt establishment, which is the ruling class of the previous government. Of course, given the fact that the previous governments nationally or the European level did not deliver, this is an easy target to say these people are feather bedding or thriving while the population is suffering, or claiming that these people don't care about people like you, not you here, but you, my audience, and on the contrary, I care about it. They tend to play up the national sovereignty against this idea of multilateral institutions. Here is the power of identity, to quote Manuel Castell's book, or what we discussed earlier. They discredit the expert. In Italy, we had, there are many Italians here, and for the non-Italians, we had an incredible row over vaccinations. They say, don't vaccinate your kids, even if it's mandatory, because these are the experts that are fundamentally trying to promote the big pharma, all these kind of things. In the city where I live, there is a Turin, there is a 5-star mayor and her motto was, I don't want anybody who did anything in this field before. I don't want the experts. There is plenty of nice cartoons on the press where someone stands up in a plane, say, I'm fed up with the pilot. Would you like me to drive the plane to the airport? Because I never did it, so I'm pure. And so this is the kind of thing. They delegitimize the media. All the media are criminals. Will form a list of the journalists to finger point them and blame them for whatever. And the immigration is the key target. To sum up, there is nothing new. If you go back to Berlusconi, for example, Berlusconi in 1984 had exactly the same message. The establishment is corrupt. There is a crisis of mani pulite. I'm different. I'm a tycoon. I'm a successful businessman. I have nothing to do with politics. Leave it to me and I'll solve the issues. That was it. If you compare Berlusconi to Trump, it's very similar. Trump came out of a crisis and said, I'm different. I'm not one of them. Leave it to me. I will change the rules of the game. And if you look at Grillo proposition, not Di Maio today. Di Maio is now very soft. But if you look at Grillo proposition, was the same. I'm a comedian. I'm not one of them. These are all crooks. Leave it to me and I'll... Of course, they are different. I don't pretend they are the same. But certainly there is a common ground and a common message among these guys. So are we all dead? I mean, are we, not us, but I mean, is the Europe as a European, as a value, a dead project? Are we going to go into a world of national identities, selfishness, whatever, or is there room for some optimism? I believe there is. Look at this data. These data are produced by Eurobarometer, which is the biggest survey of European sentiment through the years. The yellow line, the blue line is the European. Until 2007, the consensus, the backing to Europe was very high, up almost 70%. It dropped to 30%, while the Eurosceptical rose symmetrically from 30 to 70. So it was a complete flip of the two populations. Well, surprise, surprise, from 2016, the support of Europe, the consensus about Europe, is up again. And if you believe these numbers, the sample is very consistent. It's very well done. In any case, I compare apples with apples. So if there is a distortion, there is always a distortion. The distance, which here was 30 points, here is 5 points. So this is pretty remarkable. If you look at the bottom graph, it's even more interesting that even the support for European institutions is recovering. European institutions, Commission, Parliament. This is a group of, say, Eurocrats, as we call them. Is not exactly a compliment. So even the European institution, including ECB, European Parliament, Commission, had a turning point and is rising again. Maybe below 50%, but certainly there is a change in the trend, no doubt. So even the euro as a currency, that I understand, because if you abandon the euro, your savings will be dropped, etc. These are all data not for Italy, but for all the European countries. And you see the granular numbers for the European country. Italy is unfortunately one of the countries which was more favorable to Europe and now to Europe, and now is probably less. The number is this one. This is the average, and Belgium, Luxembourg, Finland. No, this is PG, should be Bulgaria, etc. They all seem to be very, very trustworthy. So what can we do? If you look in detail to what are the pros and cons to Euro, the positive and negative of Europe, and I finish here, Julie, I went too long and I apologize. But if you look at that, people still value a lot the freedom of circulation of people, goods, and services. If you come to London, you see they're all Italians. The possibility of taking a plane, going to London, and start working the day after was a big value. It will be for other countries. Erasmus was one of the greatest projects, Interrail, all these things. Then there is political and diplomatic influence, which is important because everybody agrees that France as a France, Germany as Germany, Italy as Italy is not probably a valuable proposition in the international arena. If you look today to the YouTube TV program of Macron and Trump, where Trump takes away the dandruff from Macron as you do with a child, it shows you that if we go around one by one, we don't go far. We don't go far. It's very different if you sit in front of another leader being the famous 300 million rather than 50. Then there is democracy, which is very important, cultural diversity, etc. Peace. These are all plus. If you go on the other side, on the negatives, you see sorry, I cannot read here, so that's why I'm going there. No, it's too little. So bureaucracy, youth unemployment, waste of money, which means inefficiency, crime via migration, insufficient control of external frontiers, which is yet again another way of saying migrations, etc. So what should I do? If I were there, I would try to leverage the positives. I will try to work on those positives and show our citizens that there is an advantage in Europe, and I'll try symmetrically to solve the negatives. But if we continue to focus on rules, on the 3,0 or on the 0.1% you have to correct, we don't go very far. I remember I went to it was a memorial service for Duisenberg, the ex-governor of the first governor of the central bank who died at some point. They started playing Beethoven, Inno alla Gioia, I don't know if you say it, which is the hymn of Europe. No one stand up because no one realized it was the hymn of Europe. No, it's not, I mean, it's a famous piece of music, but it's not we don't have a football team, for God's sake. Of course, the problem is to play against whom. But we should have a football team. We should have tangible things. I'm joking about these things. But we should have tangible things. And I believe that given the upswing in all those indicators, the undisputable pluses, and the common sense in this proposition, there is a lot of upside. I stop here. I apologize, I went too long.
Exactly. I think you have a microphone you're sitting on. Okay.
Not quite.
That was wonderful.
There's plenty of jokes I could crack, but I don't.
There are students here. So something that really, you mentioned at the very end. I'm, of course, a person who loves the idea of Europe. I've seen the dangers of fragmentation. I've seen the benefits of integration. One of the things that you mentioned is the wonderful Erasmus program. NYU prides itself on our global network university. That's all of our 14 sites, including New York. In some way, it's an idea like Erasmus. This, for those who don't know it, this is the opportunity for students across the European Union to move to different universities across the Schengen region and beyond, and really to exchange with one another ideas, to do research together, to study together. Tell us a little bit about how that might fit in to...
Oh yes, that was one of the best programs in Europe that then was downsized, not abandoned, but downsized to the benefit of the Polish hands or I'm nothing against the Polish hands, but all these subsidies that are probably more material but less high potential, have less high potential. The idea was very simple, that in the third year of undergrad, you could apply to this program, and according to the place in the rank, you could choose a place to go, and you spend there 1 year. If I value it from the academic viewpoint, it's so-so, because people, even as a professor in Turin, when I had Erasmus students from Bulgaria or wherever, Finland, that even speak, you had to be more generous, okay, in giving grades. Same thing, these guys that go away from home, it was probably their first experience away from home, so home meaning hometown, they didn't study like crazy, but it created a fantastic European class of youth. They all went there, speak the language, learned the culture, fell in love, all these things. And many of them remained. I don't know why from my university there was a particular flow to France and Spain. 30% of the people are still there. So it's very difficult to abandon this idea of national identity unless you create a class of young people, a class of people that are cosmopolitan in their nature, but you cannot take an old cat and transform it into a global player. It's much easier to do it with someone who's 25. And I believe, no, not 25, 20, I'm sorry. So I'm a great fan. And if I could put some money on a program, I would go on that. Interrail is another thing. You know the way it is. You buy a ticket and you go around Europe by train. But it's one of the plus. Being democratic, free circulation of people, opportunities abroad, etc. This create a European rock bottom base for a better Europe. That's what I think.
So, in his recent speech, Macron declared that we're looking at a European civil war, a war of values. And he suggests, you know the use by Viktor Orban and others of this idea of illiberal democracy or authoritarian democracy that is his brand of governance. That in place of this authoritarian democracy, Macron suggests the authority of democracy. How would you respond to that? Is that what the saving of Europe will be?
The problem in Europe is that political cycles, one of the problems in Europe is that political cycles are not synchronous. So for example, 5 years ago, the big fan of Europe was actually Merkel with Schäuble. Schäuble was very tough, but was very pro-European. And France was dragging their feet, no doubt, with Sarkozy, even partly with Hollande, but mainly with Sarkozy, etc. Then now the situation is the opposite. We have Macron, who's the champion of liberal society, and the Germans are dragging their feet. I was at the European Parliament 15 days ago, believe me. I've never seen such a mistrust from the Germans. This new minister, Scholz, who's not Schulz, is a living example, doesn't give in an inch. Same thing, Katainen, the Finn vice chairman of the commission. So there is a lot of mistrust. We all tend to agree, but at different, on a certain agenda, but at different incompatible times. One thing that proved to be wrong is to propose / you don't impose anything in Europe, but to market your values to the other countries. Because once you believe in the power of identities in general, people react very badly. When Obama said to the Britons they should vote against Britain, Innumerable taxi drivers protest with me. Why with me? I have no idea. But they were saying, what the hell does he want? We know how to do it ourselves. We don't need it. So it's undisputable that Macron is pushing the right agenda at the moment for Europe. But I doubt it will make any progress. What I know is that in this Council of Europe on the 25th of June, where the proposed agenda is very ambitious, nothing will come out. Nothing. I mean, very little issues will come out. And as an economist, I tend to look at the economy all the time. But if you look at migrations, it's even worse. Because we agreed many times on packages to redistribute the migrants into different countries. It never happened. So these governments are honestly very egoistic or, in a sense, selfish. But it's also natural because you win or lose the election domestically.
That, I think you hit
But
on the question.
many people would tell you that Merkel underperformed this time because of her attitude on migration. An alternative for Deutschland was a xenophobic, you know what it is. Party rose exactly because of that.
So what will happen with the European Parliament elections?
Well, that's an interesting case because it's purely proportional. It goes constituency by constituency. So the parliament is the end result of a very proportional vote. So I don't know what will happen. But I don't want here to be arrogant, because I'm certainly not. But it is not the European Parliament that will set the tone of the debate in Europe. It's still the heads of state. The president of the Commission could play a role. Let's see. I bet it will be a French. He or she will be a French.
Well, we've left it with the French for the moment, despite the dandruff on the collar of Emmanuel Macron. So let's open up now for some questions. I know that there are students here waiting. You've had your classes. You've been studying about Europe or European economy or emerging markets and their relationship to Europe. Are there any questions? Yeah, Eduardo.
Focusing.
Oh, wait.
Sorry. Telling me loud enough.
We're filming.
Oh, okay. So going back specifically to the identity that you're discussing, what do you personally view as a good way to move forward, focusing specifically on creating, as you said, a European identity that unifies everyone, even though we've obviously seen how difficult that is with each country having such a set core of values that if they differ, it's difficult for them to come to a middle ground, or to really focus on unity but also individualism, that every country can sort of bring their values to the table and they won't be tested by other people.
Yeah, it's a top-down, bottom-up exercise where the two directions of integration are equally important. You have to create, no politician could push an agenda which is not owned by the general public. So Germany was always very strong on inflation because Germans don't want inflation. You could not put a German agenda on Malta or vice versa because it's not owned. So in order to promote a European agenda among the general public, you must try to create this class of young European. More importantly, in the short, medium run, because you cannot wait 20 years, you must leverage the plus you have. Then it's up to the leaders. But the leaders, at the end of the day, win the election with an agenda. That's if you want, the machinery of populism. So we should try to show that the European agenda delivers. I doubt that an agenda purely built around rules and constraints is so exciting.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering what you thought about the current kind of issue of students studying in Europe and then leaving after they study to go work somewhere else, and what the European Union might be able to do to combat that and keep their educated, skilled workers within Europe.
I wouldn't limit that argument, which I favor, to Europe. When you're young, when you are a student, if you can go around, open your mind, open your eyes, try to be as, I mean, I would never exchange 1 month more, 1 month less of before the graduation with the opportunity to go around. Also because at a certain point of your life, it's possible you must stop. So try to expand, open your mind as much as possible in terms of countries, in terms of going there and coming back, but also in terms of subjects, which has nothing to do with it. So, so I'm all in favor.
What about brain drain?
What is brain drain?
Ah,
Drain, sorry,
Yeah,
no, I
yeah,
understand train.
brain drain.
I don't know any brain train to New Jersey. Well, depends on the subject. There are many subjects like research, pure research, where I'm not concerned at all about brain drain, because if you win a Nobel Prize for cell physics or DNA or whatever, do it wherever you have the best externalities. I'm not, I wouldn't suggest any hard scientist to come back to Italy for the sake of coming back to Italy. It's different if you do more humanistic studies, and it's different, I mean, I go back to that question, don't be too disciplinary, because I believe that, again, by opening up things, you connect the dots, you do many things. But brain drain, in my opinion, is, depends on the subjects, but I don't see it as, and it's never an obvious thing. Let me give you another example. When you think of brain drain, you think of people like you, or myself, or but brain drain happens in every cohort of the population. The Italian waiters in London are probably the best waiters. So the brain drain may be non-obvious and non-conventional, and may hit in areas where you don't even think of the brain drain. Think of the nurses, or the nurses in hospital, etc. This is probably the brain drain which concerns me much more than research. Because if you are a fantastic Italian nurse in a London hospital, you are in London hospital. I mean, there is no externality going back to Italy. While if you find out the new way of mapping DNA, that percolates back to Italy immediately. So think out of the box. Anyway, go around as much as you can.
I mean, Horizon 2020 was really an attempt to, with the research, to propose and to promote research around Europe, and with European researchers, so that they would collaborate and have funds to do that.
Yeah, may I say something brief on that? Because maybe not everybody knows that Europe spends a lot of money on research, also in social sciences, not only in hard science. And for some reason, they've been always very enlightened, because they always wanted to give money to consortia of universities, one per country, in different disciplines, etc. The clear example is this Horizon 2020, which is the most recent framework for research in Europe. And not only they want consortia of universities or research centers in different countries, but even they want companies. So this idea of mixing different opportunities is key, in my opinion.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Poi Gianni non ti puoi esimere.
Salve. Io posso parlare italiano o devo parlare inglese? Well, I would try to speak English. You spoke about Interrail even, Erasmus. You spoke about this ideal instrument to make all European countries more tight, more join each other, which could even be a football European thing. But one thing that I don't know if it's too utopic to think, but that I would really enjoy very much to hear, would be the language. Is the only utopic language that we heard in the past, which was Esperanto, ever named by somebody in European Parliament?
I don't know. If one of the plus of going around doing all these programs we were talking is to overcome the barriers, the language barriers, sorry. I don't want to be over optimistic or to show, but honestly, maybe I'm gifted, I don't know, for languages, but I've never seen language barriers as truly high barriers. Because after a few months in China, you speak Chinese. So Esperanto is a very interesting story, and I have to tell you an anecdote you possibly don't know. You know who... Oh yes, Esperanto is a language I never seen, because it's before my generation, probably. It was a language, a common language, partly Neo-Latin, partly Anglo-Saxon, partly... I mean, I never heard anybody speaking Esperanto.
The language to create a lingua franca, what we now call lingua franca.
Yeah, okay. But it's already the English, no? And the funny thing is that if you go to European Parliament, the only language that is common to everybody is the language of a country who's going out. Right. But anyway, if I can say something incredible you probably don't know about Esperanto, you know who invented Esperanto? It was the father of George Soros. George grew up in a cave during Nazism with his father, who instructed him about everything, of course, including Esperanto. He had invented in free time. Then when the war finished, he went to London, went to the London School and got a Ph.D. in 6 months. So to show that there are these fil rouge going around, of course, if you ask the populist, George Soros is the public villain, big villain, number one. That because he's part of the elite and not part of... Eccoci, perché se no...
2 points, Domenico, that completed your wonderful presentation are one, defense, because we have progressed on anything, but on defense we're still exactly where we started, meaning nothing. Churchill proposed a common European army early on and nobody listened. So defense. And the other one is innovation, because China has a strategy for innovation, may work on the world, but it has it. And the United States have innovation, because Google, Amazon, Apple. And Europe, thank you.
Excellent question. Let me start by defense, which is the easiest part of the question. We are right, you're right, we are at 0 level. At the moment, the only infrastructure for common defense we have is NATO. But in NATO, you fundamentally, each country decides what to do, if to intervene, not intervene. And for example, what happened in Syria last week or couple of weeks is a clear example. Some countries say, let's go and bomb. Some other countries say, you are criminals, assassins, parties in each country. So it seems to me that full cooperation in an area where people kill and die is probably the most difficult. Think of the Italian mamas. You remember when the ships was going from Taranto to Middle East? It was a difficult thing. So among the many areas, I believe that, anyway, we are nowhere. So if there is a common defense tool, it's not Europe. Innovation is very interesting, because innovation, we should leave aside for a moment the romantic view that innovation is made in the garage by geniuses, nerds, because it doesn't work like the NYU students or Stanford students. Even better, Stanford dropouts. That's very romantic. In reality, it depends on public procurement, it depends on aggregate demand, it depends on so many things. And it seems to me we are lagging behind because China, I mean, I remember when I went to the G20 in Guangzhou, we went to visit Alipay. I mean, an ocean of black hair, black heads writing, programming. I asked, how old are they? And they told me 23 and declining, because every year they were hiring younger and younger guys. Can we compete on that? I doubt. Look at here. Here, the innovation is much more driven by market forces, Google, Amazon, etc. But it's very strategic because if you went purely by economic reasoning in logics in a standalone context, you probably should break up some of these monopolies. But they don't, and they don't because they know there is a threat coming from China. So the strategic interaction between the two big players could create monsters. Where the monsters, in my opinion, it's a personal view, I don't want to convince anybody, but the real monster is big data with artificial intelligence. That's what's driving me crazy. But no one will break up these things. Why? Because they have to we have to compete with China. And what happened, I don't know how many of you followed in this proposed merger between Qualcomm and Broadcom, was exactly that, because the trophy was 5G. So it's a very delicate thing. In that sense, I correct myself, what I said before, is not entirely subject to externalities, because these are not competitive markets. So if innovation is in Guangzhou or in the Silicon Valley, it goes around the world, but not completely.
What about, especially an area that you've had a lot of experience in, and that is in green economies, sustainability? Isn't this an area where Europe could be a real innovator? I mean, I think that Italy even has had a great record so far in many areas, sectors, obviously. But couldn't this be a real area where they're key innovators?
Yes, I didn't do justice to Europe when I said it's not a land of innovation. It's not a land of innovation in big data, IT, etc. But certainly, for example, in atomic research, the CERN in Geneva is a global excellence. There is plenty of other areas in new material, in many things where we are good. So I don't mean we lag behind. I mean we are not on the forefront of this digital economy innovation. That's what I think. Anyway, if this is true, what is lacking in Europe is not cooperation, but is a central attractor, such as public procurement, such as government funds, etc., etc.
Hi, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the banking union and common deposit insurance. I mean, that may sound boring, but I wonder how you deal with a topic like that when, on the one hand, it's necessary to avoid a repeat of what happened after 2007, 2008. On the other hand, I think it very much feeds into the populist point. I mean, I would argue that the German government, the CDU, is kind of reluctant on many things because they do not want to concede that point to the right-wing populist opposition, right? The point being that the good, thrifty German taxpayer and saver ultimately has to foot the bill for irresponsible savers and bad loans in, we all know where they are, right? How do you deal with that type of technical reform in the face of populism and a somewhat lagging sense of common shared responsibility and solidarity?
For the non-experts, what is at stake here is fundamentally mutualizing risk. Because what is the banking union is fundamentally common supervision, stress tests, etc., but insurance deposit, which means that if your bank, if a Greek bank or an Italian bank goes bust, there should be an insurance that insures the deposit coming from the other countries. This, of course, might even be the source of moral hazard, no? Because I don't care about the risk, because I know that when things go very badly, my depositors are insured. What is the mantra in this? This is very important also because if you don't have common deposit insurance, there are no cross-border deals among banks, and eventually a European capital market will never develop. And this is key because Europe, by delegating all the financial transactions to London, was never able to develop a global capital market like here. So now we are at a terrible bifurcation. Shall we allow cross-border booking of this transaction to New York and London, and at the end of the day, we will never ever develop this capital market again, or shall we try to develop our own, but what happens in the interim is a long story. But mutualization is the problem. Be it, let me give you another example. All the banks buy government bonds. If you allow them to buy without any risk weighting, which is without any special capital requirement for these purchases, and if one country, say country I, goes bust, what happened to the Bank of the Eurozone? This kind of arguments. The mantra by the German, are you German yourself? Yeah, it's not a problem. Huh? No, nobody's perfect. No, you're not German. Okay, no problem. It's not. I have no stigma for it. So the mantra by the Germans was very rational. And it said, we will never mutualize risk if we don't reduce risk before. You reduce risk and then we mutualize. The problem is that they never put it that way. They always said, you reduce risk and then we discuss, which is a bit more fishy as an argument. Certainly, this position, which is entirely rational, I don't mutualize my credit and your debit if you have huge debit and I have only credit. No, but the point is that it has been used also as an excuse to drag the feet. As I told you, I went to a conference on this topic a couple of weeks ago in the European Parliament, and I've never seen such a huge distrust. So this is, if you want, this is the conundrum, that we have a partial, it's a catch-22, because only an integrated Europe will work, but until the situation is this one, no one wants to create an integrated Europe.
So I think this brings us back to the question of trust and the kind of leadership that you think will be necessary to let's say, recharge the union and the spirit of the Rome Agreement and of the leaders of this great idea of integration as opposed to fragmentation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. It was wonderful. Thank you. Oh, absolutely. You can have the last word. I just want to remind everybody there's a reception and a particular opportunity for students because Professor Siniscalco has made a point of wanting to talk with the students, so we'll go to the reception, and then students, you can gather around him. But you get the last word. Thank you, Stefano.
No, the last word is simply to thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed. Just one final remark. To build a union, to make a union, to make a nation takes a lot of time. In this country, you even had civil war, which I hope it will never happen in Europe. But So at the end of the day, never be impatient, because if you are impatient, you're going to be frustrated. Thank you very much.